The mule cart creaked and groaned its way down the rutted trail toward Morrow Creek, each jolt sending a sharp pain through Olivia May's spine. She'd been riding since dawn, her tall frame folded uncomfortably on the hard wooden bench, one hand gripping the side rail while the other clutched a leather trunk that contained everything she owned in this world. The October wind cut through her woolen coat like a blade, carrying with it the promise of an early winter. Old Samuel, the carter she'd hired back in Cedar Falls, spat tobacco juice into the dust and glanced back at her with rheumy eyes. "That there's Morrow Creek, miss. Ain't much to look at, but it's got 4 walls and folks who mind their own business. Mostly." Olivia nodded, not trusting her voice, in the pocket of her traveling dress. Folded and refolded until the creases had worn thin, lay the letter that had brought her to this moment. She'd memorized every word during the 3-day journey, each elegant script line burning deeper into her memory with every mile. "My dearest Olivia," it had begun, in Theodore's careful penmanship. "It is with the heaviest of hearts that I must inform you of a change in our circumstances." Change. Such a delicate word for the destruction of everything she'd planned. Theodore Whitman III, son of a prominent Missouri banker, had courted her for 2 years. He'd promised her a life of comfort, children, a home with real glass windows and a piano in the parlor. All she had to do was wait while he established his law practice. She'd waited, and while waiting, she'd done what she'd always done: worked. When the Hendricks outfit needed a cook for their cattle drive to Kansas City, she'd taken the job. Good money, honest work, and she'd always been handy with a Dutch oven. For 4 months, she'd fed 30 cowboys 3 meals a day, brewing coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe and baking biscuits that had grown men near to tears with homesickness. But word travels faster than cattle, and somehow news of her employment reached the refined ears of Mrs. Constance Whitman. Theodore's letter arrived 2 weeks after she'd returned, still smelling of trail dust and campfire smoke. "Mother has expressed her deepest concerns about your recent employment. While I admire your industrious spirit, I fear that your choice to work alongside rough men in such unseemly conditions has irrevocably damaged your reputation. A woman who would choose such work, Mother says, lacks the delicate sensibilities required of a banker's wife." Delicate sensibilities? Olivia almost laughed, but it came out as a bitter sound that made Samuel glance back again. She'd seen delicate women on the trail, crying over broken china and fainting at the sight of a snake. They hadn't lasted a week, but she had. She'd lasted, thrived even, and apparently that was her great sin. The cart lurched to a stop at the edge of town, and Olivia climbed down, her muscles stiff from the journey. She handed Samuel his payment carefully counted coins that represented a good portion of her savings and hefted her trunk. "Boarding house is 2 streets over," Samuel offered, pointing with his whip. "Mrs. Eliza Thornberry runs it. Widow woman, fair prices. Don't ask too many questions." Olivia thanked him and began walking, her boots raising small clouds of dust with each step. Morrow Creek spread before her like a question mark, a single main street lined with false front buildings, their unpainted wood already graying in the harsh weather. The Mercantile, a blacksmith, what appeared to be 2 competing saloons, and various other establishments that marked a town still deciding what it wanted to become. People noticed her, of course. A woman traveling alone always drew attention in a frontier town. She kept her chin up, meeting curious gazes with steady gray eyes that had stared down charging steers and drunken trail hands. Let them look. Let them wonder. She'd be gone after the first snow anyway, heading further west where the past couldn't follow. The boarding house sat on a corner lot, a 2-story building that had seen better days but appeared clean and sturdy. Mrs. Thornberry answered the door herself, a small, sharp-eyed woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. "I need a room," Olivia said simply. "I can pay a week in advance." Mrs. Thornberry's gaze traveled from Olivia's travel-stained dress to her calloused hands, taking in details with the efficiency of a woman who'd learned to judge character quickly. Kitchen privileges are extra. No gentlemen callers after 8. Breakfast is at 6 sharp. That's acceptable. The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window that looked out onto the back alley. Olivia set down her trunk and sat on the bed, suddenly exhausted. She was 26 years old, unmarried, with skills that apparently made her unsuitable for polite society. Her mother would be mortified if she were still alive. Her father, well, he'd taught her to work hard and stand tall, and she was doing both, even if it led her to this moment. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Thornberry stood in the hallway with a wash basin and pitcher. "Supper's in an hour if you're interested. Nothing fancy, just stew and cornbread. 2 bits. "Thank you," Olivia said, accepting the basin. "Mrs. Thornberry, I'm a fair cook myself. If you ever need help in the kitchen." The older woman's eyes sharpened. "Might be I could use an extra pair of hands now and then. We'll see." After washing the trail dust from her face and hands, Olivia made her way downstairs to the dining room. Several boarders were already seated, a drummer with a sample case at his feet, 2 miners who looked like brothers, and an elderly man reading a week-old newspaper. They glanced up as she entered, nodded politely, and returned to their meals. The stew was adequate, the cornbread dry. Olivia ate mechanically, planning. She had enough money to last perhaps 2 months if she was careful. She needed work. But what kind? Not cooking for another cattle drive. That bridge was thoroughly burned. Perhaps the mercantile needed help, or one of the saloons, though that would cement her reputation as a fallen woman, as if cooking honest food for honest men hadn't already done that. She was so lost in thought that she didn't notice the dining room door open until a blast of cold air swept through the room. A man stood in the doorway, tall and broad-shouldered, cradling his left arm against his chest. His face was weathered like old leather, with lines that spoke of too many years squinting into the sun. Dark hair curled out from under a battered hat that had seen better decades. "Mrs. Thornberry," he said, his voice low and graveled. "Sorry to trouble you at supper." "Wade Langston," the landlady scolded, rising from her seat. "What have you done to yourself now?" Horse had a difference of opinion during roundup. Shoulders out of joint, but it's back in place now. Just need a place to rest up for a day or 2. "Mrs." Thornberry tisked and fussed, leading him to an empty chair. Olivia found herself watching as he moved careful, controlled, like a man who knew exactly how much pain he could endure and was dancing right on that edge. When he sat, a slight grimace crossed his features before he schooled them back to neutrality. The stew bowl Mrs. Thornberry placed before him might as well have been a challenge. He stared at it, then at his injured arm, clearly calculating the mechanics of eating with his right hand while his left hung useless. Before she could think better of it, Olivia rose and moved to the sideboard where the cornbread sat. She selected a piece, split it open, and ladled stew over it, creating something that could be eaten one-handed. She placed it before the cowboy without a word and returned to her seat. He looked at the plate, then at her, surprise flickering in eyes the color of winter prairie grass. "Much obliged, ma'am." Olivia nodded and returned to her own meal, but she could feel his gaze on her as he ate. When he finished, he pushed back his chair and stood, that same careful movement that spoke of long practice with injury. "That was fine eating," he said, addressing the room in general but looking at her. "You cook stew like that again, and I'll build you a kitchen." The words were out before anyone expected them, hanging in the air like smoke. The drummer coughed. The miners exchanged glances. Mrs. Thornberry's eyebrows climbed toward her hairline. Olivia met his gaze steadily. "I didn't cook it." "No," he agreed. "But you knew what a working man needs when he's hurting. That's rarer than good cooking." He touched the brim of his hat and left, leaving behind the scent of leather and horse and something else, the indefinable smell of a man who lived under open sky. Olivia stared at her empty bowl, wondering why her heart was racing over such a simple exchange. "Wade Langston, Mrs." Thornberry said, settling back into her chair with the satisfaction of a woman who enjoyed sharing information. "Runs cattle up on the ridge, about 5 miles north. Good man. Keeps to himself mostly. Had some trouble a few years back. Woman from back east came out to marry him, took one look at that cabin of his, and caught the next stage back to civilization." "Sensible woman," one of the miners muttered, earning a sharp look from the landlady. "Wade's problem is he doesn't know how to bend," she continued. "That woman wanted him to sell the ranch, move to town, maybe take up clerking in a store. Might as well ask a mountain to dance." Olivia understood. Some people were shaped by the land they lived on, becoming as unbending as granite, as enduring as prairie grass. Theodore had been shaped by different forces, by society's expectations and his mother's ambitions. When those forces pressed against Olivia's own nature, something had to give. It hadn't been her. That night, lying in the narrow bed, listening to the wind rattle the windows, Olivia thought about kitchens and wounded cowboys and the way a man could make a simple statement sound like a promise. She thought about Theodore's letter, still folded in her pocket, and realized with surprise that it had lost some of its sting. Tomorrow she would look for work. Tomorrow she would begin building whatever life this rough town would allow her. But tonight, she permitted herself one small fantasy, a kitchen of her own, with windows facing the mountains and a stove that never grew cold. Outside, the first snowflakes of the season began to fall, dancing in the lamplight like tiny promises. Winter was coming early to Morrow Creek, but for the first time since leaving Missouri, Olivia May didn't mind the cold. 3 days passed before Olivia saw Wade Langston again. She'd found work at the Sagebrush Saloon, not serving drinks, which would have sealed her reputation entirely, but cooking the noon meal for the miners and ranch hands who preferred solid food to liquid courage. The owner, Jake Morrison, had been skeptical at first, but one taste of her beef and beans changed his mind. "Where'd you learn to cook like that?" he'd asked, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "On the trail," she'd answered simply, and something in her tone discouraged further questions. The sagebrush wasn't fancy rough plank floors, scarred tables, and a bar that had seen its share of spilled whiskey and blood, but the kitchen was well equipped, and Jake gave her free rein as long as the food appeared on time and the men left satisfied. She started each morning at 5, preparing biscuits and gravy, beans that would simmer all morning, and whatever meat Jake had managed to procure. It was during the noon rush that Wade appeared again. She noticed him immediately. He moved differently than the miners who thundered in demanding food and beer. He found a corner table, set his hat on an empty chair, and waited with the patience of a man who understood that good things took time. Olivia served the miners first, ladling generous portions onto tin plates and deflecting their good-natured flirtation with practiced ease. She'd learned on the cattle drive that feeding men was one thing, encouraging them was another entirely. When she finally reached Wade's table, carrying a plate heaped with beef stew and fresh biscuits, he was reading a small, leather-bound book. "Poetry?" she asked, surprised into speech as she set the plate before him. He glanced up, those prairie grass eyes holding a hint of amusement. "Man can't live on beef alone." "Whose?" "Wordsworth today. Sometimes Byron, when the mood strikes." He closed the book carefully, treating it with the same respect another man might show a Bible. "Though I'd trade them all for a meal like this." She should have moved on to the next table, but something held her there. His shoulders seemed better. He moved both arms freely as he ate, but there were new lines around his eyes, the kind that came from pushing through pain too long. "Shoulder healing well?" she asked. "Well enough." He took a bite of biscuit, chewed thoughtfully. "You didn't answer my question the other night." "You didn't ask one." "Didn't I?" He set down his fork, giving her his full attention. Then I'll ask it now. Can you cook like this every night? The saloon noise faded to a distant hum. Olivia was aware of Jake watching from behind the bar, of the miners calling for more coffee, of the weight of this moment balanced on a knife's edge. "Only for someone who doesn't leave when things get hard," she heard herself say. Something shifted in his expression, surprise, perhaps, or recognition. He nodded slowly, as if she'd answered more than his simple question. "Fair enough," he said, returning to his meal. Olivia fled to the kitchen, her cheeks burning though she couldn't say why. Through the serving window, she watched him eat with methodical precision, cleaning his plate completely before leaving payment on the table. He didn't look back as he left. "That Wade Langston?" Jake asked later, counting the coins Wade had left. "He usually cooks for himself up on that ridge. Must have heard about your cooking." "Must have," Olivia agreed, scrubbing a pot with more force than necessary. Wade returned the next day, and the next. Always the same corner table, always with his book of poetry, always leaving payment that was exactly right plus a little extra. They developed a rhythm. She'd bring his food. He'd make some observation about the weather or the town. She'd respond with equal brevity. It wasn't quite friendship, but it was something. On the 5th day, he wasn't carrying his poetry book. Instead, he watched her move through the crowded saloon with an intensity that made her self-conscious. When she brought his plate pork and beans today, with cornbread still warm from the oven, he caught her wrist gently. "I need to ask you something," he said, low enough that only she could hear. She glanced around, but no one was paying attention. "Ask." "My shoulder's healing, but not fast enough. I've got stock that needs tending, fences that need mending before the real snow comes. I could use help." "You're asking me to come work for you?" "I'm asking you to cook for me while I heal. Few weeks, maybe a month, room and board, plus wages." He released her wrist, but she could still feel the warmth of his fingers. "The ridge is isolated, 5 miles from town. Rough trail, snow's coming early this year." "Why me?" He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw past the weathered exterior to something else, a loneliness that recognized its own kind. "Because you're the first person in 3 years to see a man with one working arm and think about what he needed instead of what he couldn't do," he said simply. Olivia turned his words over in her mind that night, lying in her narrow boarding house bed. The offer was practical, respectable, even a hired cook for a wounded rancher. But there was something else beneath the surface, some current she couldn't quite name. She thought of Theodore, of his mother's disdainful words about her unseemly work. Would cooking for a single man in an isolated cabin be the final nail in her reputation's coffin? Did she care? The next morning brought the answer in the form of Marcus Whitman, Theodore's cousin, of all the cursed luck. She was buying supplies at the Mercantile when he walked in, his city clothes marking him as clearly as a brand. Recognition dawned in his pale eyes, followed quickly by that particular smile she'd learned to hate during her engagement. "Miss Bennett," he said, emphasizing the miss as if it were a disease. "What an unexpected pleasure. We'd heard you'd left Missouri." "Mr. Whitman." She kept her voice level, her hands steady on the counter. "Shopping for your employer." His gaze took in her simple dress, her work-roughened hands. "Theodore mentioned you'd taken up cooking professionally." The way he said it made it sound like something else entirely. The shopkeeper, Mr. Chen, busied himself with his ledger, but Olivia could feel his attention. "Yes," she said simply. "I cook." "How suitable." Marcus's smile widened. "Though I suppose options are limited for a woman of your experience." The bell over the door chimed, and Wade Langston entered, bringing with him the scent of coming snow. He took in the scene with one glance, Marcus's predatory smile, Olivia's rigid posture, the tension that filled the small space like smoke. "Miss Bennett," he said, touching his hat brim. Thought I might find you here, if you're still considering my offer. I brought the wagon." Marcus's eyebrows climbed. "Your offer?" Wade turned those prairie grass eyes on the city man, and something in his steady gaze made Marcus take a half-step back. "Miss Bennett has agreed to help me through the winter, cooking and such, while my shoulder heals." "Has she—" Marcus's voice carried all the insinuation he could manage. "How enterprising." "Yes," Wade agreed pleasantly. "She's a woman who understands the value of honest work. Not everyone does." The two men stood facing each other, Marcus in his tailored coat and polished boots, Wade in worn canvas and leather that had shaped itself to his body through years of use. It was like watching silk compare itself to steel. "I should finish my shopping," Olivia said into the silence. "Take your time," Wade said. "I'll load your trunk from the boarding house. Mrs. Thornberry said you'd settled your account." He left without waiting for a response, the bell chiming his exit. Marcus lingered a moment longer, his smile now edged with something sharper. "I'll be sure to write Theodore," he said. "Let him know you're well settled." "You do that," Olivia replied. "Tell him I've found work that suits me perfectly." After he left, "Mr. Chen emerged from behind his counter. "That cowboy," he said quietly. "He's a good man, quiet, keeps his word. That other one." He spat into a brass spittoon. "City men like that think they own the world." Olivia finished her purchases: coffee, flour, salt pork, dried beans, everything needed to stock a bachelor's kitchen. Outside, snow was beginning to fall in earnest, fat flakes that promised a serious storm. Wade sat on the wagon seat, her trunk already loaded in the back. "You sure about this?" he asked as she climbed up beside him. "You said just until your shoulder heals. Or until you want to leave, whichever comes first." She thought about Marcus's sneer, about Theodore's letter still in her pocket, about the narrow boarding house room and the curious eyes of the town. Then she looked at Wade, solid, quiet, real in a way Theodore had never been. "Drive on, Mr. Langston," she said. "That snow's not going to wait for us to make up our minds." He smiled then, just a slight lift at the corner of his mouth, and clicked to the horses. As they pulled away from town, Olivia didn't look back. Whatever lay ahead on that ridge, it had to be better than what she was leaving behind. The snow fell harder as they climbed, turning the world white and clean and new. Wade drove with steady confidence despite his healing shoulder, occasionally pointing out landmarks: a lightning-struck pine, a cluster of rocks that looked like a bear, the place where the trail split between his land and his neighbor's. "You never asked why I said yes," Olivia said as they entered a grove of aspens. "Figured you'd tell me if you wanted me to know." She studied his profile: the strong nose, the jaw stubbled with a day's growth, the way his hands held the reins with gentle authority. "A man from my past just made it clear that my reputation is thoroughly ruined. Seemed like a good day to stop pretending otherwise." "Reputation." Wade said the word like it tasted bad. "Never put much stock in what people say, more interested in what they do." "And what do I do?" He glanced at her then, snow catching in his eyelashes. "You see what needs doing and you do it. Without fuss, without asking for credit. That tells me more than all the talk in the world." They rode in comfortable silence after that, the snow muffling all sound except the creak of wheels and the steady breathing of horses. Olivia pulled her shawl tighter and allowed herself, for the first time in weeks, to simply exist in the moment, not planning, not worrying, just riding through the snow beside a man who valued poetry and plain speaking in equal measure. The ridge appeared through the snow like something from a fairy tale, and, despite herself, Olivia felt her heart lift. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight she would cook a real meal in a real kitchen for a man who wouldn't judge her for knowing how. It wasn't much, perhaps, but it was enough. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by Tom Brennan's boy, who'd ridden up from town despite the worsening weather. Olivia was kneading bread when Wade brought it to her. his expression carefully neutral. "From Missouri," was all he said, setting it on the table beside her flowered workspace. She recognized Theodore's handwriting immediately, though this letter bore signs of haste, ink blots, and uneven lines that spoke of agitation. For a long moment, she simply stared at it, her hands still buried in dough. "I'll be in the barn," Wade said quietly, and left her to her privacy. The letter was shorter than the first, but no less devastating in its way. "Olivia, Marcus has written of your circumstances. I find myself compelled by conscience and past affection to offer you rescue from your current situation. Despite the irregularities of your recent behavior, Mother has agreed to reconsider if you return immediately and submit to proper guidance. A woman's reputation, once lost, can sometimes be salvaged through quick action and genuine repentance. I await your response. Theodore." Rescue. Repentance. The words rang hollow as church bells in an empty town. Olivia set the letter aside and returned to her bread, kneading with perhaps more force than necessary. Through the kitchen window, she could see Wade working with a young horse, his movements careful but determined despite his healing shoulder. He'd removed his coat despite the cold, and she could see the way he favored his left side, the slight hitch when he raised his arm too high. She'd been at the ridge for 5 days now, and they'd settled into a routine as comfortable as worn boots. She rose before dawn to start the stove and make coffee. He handled the morning chores while she prepared breakfast. They ate together in companionable silence, then went their separate way, he to the endless work of maintaining a ranch before winter, she to the kitchen and the small vegetable garden that needed harvesting before the killing frost. Evenings were the revelation. After supper, when the dishes were done and the fire burned low, Wade would read aloud from his books, not just poetry, but histories and natural philosophy, stories of far places and grand adventures. His voice, rough from days of calling cattle, transformed when he read, becoming something rich and layered. Olivia would mend clothes or work on the quilt squares she'd found in a trunk, letting the words wash over her like warm water. The bread dough was ready for rising. She shaped it into loaves, covered them with a clean cloth, and set them near the stove. Then she picked up Theodore's letter again, reading it once more before feeding it to the fire. The paper curled and blackened, taking with it the last of her ties to that old life. "Bad news?" Wade asked when he came in for the noon meal. Snow dusted his shoulders and clung to his dark hair. "Old news," she corrected, ladling venison stew into bowls. "Nothing that matters now." He studied her face for a moment, then nodded. They ate in silence, but it was the comfortable quiet of two people who didn't need words to fill the space between them. When he finished, he pushed back from the table and retrieved something from a shelf by the door. "Thought you might use this," he said, setting a wooden box before her. Inside, nested in faded velvet, lay a set of kitchen knives, good steel, bone handles worn smooth by use. Olivia lifted one, testing its weight and balance. It was perfectly maintained, the edge sharp enough to split a hair. "They were my mother's," Wade said quietly. "Been sitting there gathering dust since, well, for a while now. Seems a shame, good tools going unused." "I can't." "You can," he interrupted gently. "Tools want to be used, same as people want to be useful. You'd be doing them a kindness." That evening, as she prepared supper using the inherited knives, Olivia found herself humming something she hadn't done since leaving Missouri. The venison sliced cleanly, the vegetables diced with precision, good tools in skilled hands, creating something nourishing from raw materials. There was a metaphor in there somewhere, but she was too content to chase it down. Wade came in just as she was pulling cornbread from the oven. "Smells like heaven in here," he said, hanging his coat and hat by the door. "Just cornbread," she replied, but she was pleased. "Supper'll be ready in a few minutes." "I need to tell you something," he said, and something in his tone made her turn. That man in town, the one in the fancy clothes, He's been asking questions about you. Olivia's hand stilled on the cornbread pan. Marcus, he's my former fiancé's cousin. Former, Wade repeated, as if tasting the word. Good. Man who'd let family speak for him isn't worth much anyway. You don't know the whole story. Don't need to. He moved to the wash basin, rolling up his sleeves. I know you're here now, working hard, making this place feel more like home than it's felt in years. That's enough. After supper, instead of reading, Wade pulled out a worn deck of cards. You play? A little. She'd learned from the Cowboys on the drive, though she suspected her poker face needed work. They played gin rummy, the cards soft with age and handling. Wade's hands, she noticed, were gentle with the worn pasteboards, the same way they were gentle with horses and books and everything else he touched. Working man's hands, scarred and calloused, but capable of surprising delicacy. Why poetry? She asked suddenly, discarding a 3 of clubs. He considered his hand, rearranged 2 cards. Started when I was laid up with a broken leg. Must have been 15 or 16. Old man who worked for my father left a book behind. Figured I'd pass the time reading it. He drew a card, smiled slightly. Turned out words could build whole worlds, same as hammers and nails, just different materials. Theodore thought poetry was for women and weak men, Olivia said before she could stop herself. Wade's eyes flicked up to hers. Theodore sounds like a man who's afraid of anything he doesn't understand. Gin. He laid out his cards, a perfect hand. Olivia laughed, surprising herself with the sound. You hustled me. Never said I played a little, he replied. But he was smiling too. Another hand. They played until the fire burned low and the wind picked up outside, rattling the windows in their frames. When Olivia finally stood to bank the fire for the night, Wade spoke quietly. That letter today, you burned it. It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. Yes. Good. He stood as well, stretching carefully. Some bridges are meant to be crossed, others are meant to be burned. Knowing the difference, that's wisdom. That night, listening to the wind howl around the cabin, Olivia thought about bridges and wisdom and the way Wade's eyes crinkled when he truly smiled. She thought about Theodore's offer of rescue and realized she didn't feel like someone who needed saving. If anything, she felt like someone who'd finally found solid ground after months of drifting. The next morning brought Marcus himself, riding a hired horse with the awkwardness of a man more comfortable in carriages. Olivia saw him through the kitchen window as she mixed biscuit dough, watched Wade walk out to meet him. The 2 men stood in the yard, their conversation carried away by the wind, but she could read the tension in their postures. When Marcus finally left, his face red with more than cold, Wade came into the kitchen. Snow melted from his boots, forming small puddles on the plank floor. He wanted to speak with you. Wade insisted, said he had important news from Theodore. And I told him you were busy with important work and couldn't be disturbed. He moved to the stove, warming his hands. Also told him the trail gets mighty treacherous this time of year. Man could get lost easy, especially if he didn't know the landmarks. Was that a threat, Mr. Langston? Just neighborly advice, he said mildly. Though I might have mentioned that the last city man who got lost up here wasn't found until spring thaw. Olivia turned back to her biscuits to hide her smile. That seems unlikely. Oh, it's true enough. Of course, he was only lost for a few hours before someone found him and pointed him back to town. But Marcus doesn't need to know that part. They were still laughing when the biscuits came out of the oven, golden and perfect. Wade split one open, steam rising, and spread it with butter and honey from his own hives. He took a bite, closed his eyes in appreciation. I take it back, he said. Take what back? Before, I said I'd build you a kitchen if you cooked like that again. This is better. This deserves a whole house. The words hung between them, heavier than jest but lighter than promise. Olivia felt her cheeks warm and busied herself with the coffee pot. "Just biscuits," she murmured. "No," Wade said quietly. "Not just anything, not anymore." That afternoon, while Wade worked with the horses, Olivia made her decision. She found paper and pen in the desk by the window and wrote a brief letter to Theodore. No explanations, no justifications, just 5 words. "I've found my own rescue." She gave it to Tom Brennan's boy the next time he rode up, along with a coin for postage. As she watched him disappear down the trail, she felt something lift from her shoulders, the last weight of other people's expectations, finally set down. Wade found her there by the window as the sun set, painting the snow-covered mountains in shades of rose and gold. He didn't speak, just stood beside her, solid and sure as the mountains themselves. "No regrets?" he asked finally. Olivia thought of Theodore's pale hands, his mother's cutting words, the life of parlor pianos and glass windows that had once seemed so grand. Then she looked at Wade, his work-roughened hands, his quiet strength, the way he made her feel both capable and cherished. "No," she said firmly. "No regrets." He nodded, satisfied, and they stood together watching the light fade from the peaks. Tomorrow there would be work, always work on a ranch, but for now, this moment was enough. The kitchen was warm, the bread was rising, and she was exactly where she belonged. Sometimes the best rescue was the one you gave yourself. The cabin sat tucked into the ridge like a secret, half buried under pine boughs heavy with snow. As the wagon creaked to a stop, Olivia took in the modest structure, log walls chinked with mud and moss, a stone chimney releasing a thin thread of smoke, windows covered with oiled paper that glowed softly in the fading light. It was nothing like the grand house Theodore had promised, with its planned parlor and imported wallpaper. It was better. It was real. Wade climbed down first, moving carefully around to help her from the wagon. His hands were steady at her waist as he lifted her down, and for a moment they stood close in the swirling snow, her hands on his shoulders for balance. "It's not much," he said, something like apology in his voice. "It's solid," she replied, and saw the tension ease from his shoulders. He led her inside while snow continued to fall, thick and silent. The cabin was one main room with a loft above, everything visible at a glance. The kitchen occupied one wall, a good cast-iron stove, shelves lined with preserves and dry goods, a table scarred by years of use. A stone fireplace dominated another wall, with 2 chairs positioned before it. In the far corner stood a bed, neatly made with a quilt that looked hand-stitched. Everything was clean, ordered. Speaking of a man who took care with his possessions. "Lofts for storage," Wade said, following her gaze. "But I can clear it out, make a proper sleeping space." "That won't be necessary." Olivia interrupted. She moved to the stove, checking the firebox, testing the dampers. Everything was well maintained, just like the knives he'd given her. "Where will you sleep?" He gestured to the space near the fireplace. "I'll bed down here. Done it before during calving season when I needed to keep the fire going all night." She turned to study him, this man who read poetry and gentled horses, who'd offered her work without questions or judgments. "That's your bed," she said, nodding toward the corner. "You need proper rest for that shoulder to heal." "Miss Bennett." "Olivia," she corrected. "If we're going to share a cabin through winter, we might as well use given names." "Olivia." He said it carefully, like he was tasting something new. "I won't be the one sleeping comfortable while you make do with blankets on the floor." "Then we'll take turns," she said practically. "Or string a curtain for privacy. We'll work it out as needed. Right now, I need to see what supplies you have so I can start supper." Wade stood there a moment longer, and she could see him wrestling with propriety and practicality. Finally, he nodded. "I'll bring in your trunk and see to the horses." While he worked outside, Olivia explored the kitchen properly. The shelves were well stocked, but organized by a bachelor's logic coffee next to soap, beans mixed with ammunition. She found a good skillet, a Dutch oven, various pots that showed signs of hard use but careful cleaning. In a crock, she discovered sourdough starter, still active despite the cold. By the time Wade returned, she had water heating and was mixing biscuit dough. He stopped in the doorway, snow-covered, watching her work. "What?" she asked, not looking up from her mixing bowl. "Nothing. Just the kitchen looks right with you in it." The simple honesty of the statement made her hands still. She'd received elaborate compliments from Theodore, poetry-laden phrases about her beauty and grace. But none had moved her like this plain, speaking from a man who meant exactly what he said. "Hang up that wet coat before you catch your death," she said, her voice rougher than intended. Supper was simple beans she'd found already soaking, biscuits and dried apple pie she managed from the preserves. They ate quietly, the only sounds the pop of the fire and the wind testing the windows. When they finished, Wade insisted on helping with dishes despite her protests about his shoulder. "I'm not an invalid," he said, taking up a dish towel. "Work needs doing. I do my share. That's how it is." They worked side by side, her washing, him drying, finding a rhythm without words. Outside, the snow fell heavier, erasing the world beyond the windows. The cabin became an island of warmth and light in a sea of white. When the dishes were done and put away, Wade pulled out blankets and began making a bed near the fireplace. Olivia watched him struggle one-handed with the heavy wool. "This is foolish," she said finally. "You'll aggravate that shoulder sleeping on the floor." "I've slept worse places." "That's not the point." She moved to help him with the blankets, their hands tangling in the wool. "We're both adults. We're both here by choice. That bed is big enough to share if we're practical about it." Wade went very still. "Olivia, I've slept in worse conditions too," she continued briskly. "On the trail, sometimes we'd have 3 to a tent during storms. This is just practical. We can bundle boards between us if it makes you feel better, but you're not sleeping on the floor with an injured shoulder while I take your bed." He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him measuring her words, weighing propriety against pragmatism. Finally, he smiled, just a slight quirk of his lips. "You're a hard woman to argue with." "I've been told that before," she agreed. "Usually by men who were wrong." They prepared for sleep with careful courtesy, taking turns behind the curtained corner where the wash basin stood. Olivia changed into her nightgown and wrapper, braided her hair, and emerged to find Wade already in bed, fully clothed except for his boots, lying on top of the quilts. "You'll freeze," she said. "I'll be fine." She sighed and climbed into the other side of the bed, pulling the quilts up to her chin. The bed was indeed large enough for 2, with space between them. She could feel his warmth, though, hear his breathing in the dark. "Wade," she said quietly. Thank you. For the job, the shelter, for not asking questions I wasn't ready to answer." "Thank you," he replied after a moment, "for saying yes." She lay awake long after his breathing deepened into sleep, listening to the storm outside and the fire settling in the grate. The cabin creaked and sighed around them, a living thing sheltering them from the wild. At some point, Wade shifted in his sleep, murmuring something that might have been poetry or might have been pain. Without thinking, she reached out and touched his shoulder gently. He settled immediately, sighing into deeper sleep. This was trust, she realized. Not the grand gestures Theodore had specialized in, but this quiet sharing of space and warmth against the storm. She'd trusted cowboys on the trail with her safety. But this was different. This was choosing to be vulnerable with someone who understood that strength and gentleness could live in the same person. Morning came late, the storm having blocked the windows with snow. Olivia woke to find Wade already up, feeding the fire, moving stiffly in the cold. "How's the shoulder?" she asked, sitting up. He turned, and she saw surprise flicker across his face at her easy manner. "Better for having slept in a real bed. Coffee's on." They fell into a routine over the following days. Morning coffee and companionable silence. Breakfast eaten while planning the day's necessary tasks. Wade would handle what outside chores he could manage one-armed while Olivia worked her magic in the kitchen. She baked bread, made preserves from the last of the wild berries, prepared hearty meals that stuck to a man's ribs. In the evenings, they maintained their careful dance around the sleeping arrangements. Wade would read aloud while she mended or worked on the quilt. When darkness fell, they'd retire to opposite sides of the bed, a careful distance maintained between them. But distance was hard to keep in sleep, more than once. Olivia woke to find they'd drifted together in the night, drawn by warmth or instinct, Wade's arm around her waist, her head on his shoulder. They'd separate with careful courtesy, neither acknowledging these nighttime betrayals of their careful daytime boundaries. On the fourth night, the temperature plummeted, even with the fire banked high. Cold seeped through the cabin walls. Olivia lay shivering despite the quilts, trying not to let her teeth chatter. She felt Wade shift beside her. "Come here," he said quietly. "I'm fine." "No, you're not, and neither am I. Come here." She moved closer, and he pulled her against his side, sharing his warmth. He was still fully clothed, she still properly covered, but the intimacy of the gesture made her heart race. "Just warmth," he murmured. "Nothing more than what's freely given." "I know," she whispered back. They lay like that, her head on his good shoulder, his arm around her, while the storm raged outside. She could hear his heartbeat, steady and strong, could smell the mixture of soap and wood smoke that clung to him. "Tell me about the cattle drive," he said into the darkness. So she did. Told him about the dust and the danger, the way coffee tasted after 18 hours in the saddle, the songs the cowboys sang to keep the cattle calm. She told him about lightning storms on the open prairie and river crossings gone wrong, about the pride of bringing the herd in safe. "Must have been something," he said when she finished. "Seeing all that country, it was, but—" She hesitated, then continued. "It was lonely, too, being the only woman, always keeping walls up, never quite belonging. I was glad when it ended." His arm tightened slightly around her. "You belong here," he said simply. "This place has been waiting for someone like you." They didn't speak more, but Olivia felt something settle deep in her chest. When morning came, they woke, tangled together, and this time neither pulled away immediately. Wade's eyes were soft in the gray dawn light, studying her face like it was one of his books. "Morning," he said quietly. "Morning," she replied. He reached up with his good hand, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. The gesture was so gentle, so careful, that her breath caught. "I won't be the one remembering this night with regret," he said, echoing his words from that first evening. "Neither will I," she whispered. He smiled then, that rare full smile that transformed his weathered face. "Good. Now, how about some of that coffee?" They rose and began another day. But something had shifted. The careful distance remained during daylight hours, but there was warmth beneath it now, an acknowledgement of what was growing between them. That night, when they retired, Olivia didn't wait for the cold to drive them together. She simply moved into Wade's waiting arms, feeling like she'd come home at last. Outside, the snow continued to fall, sealing them into their small world of firelight and quiet understanding. Whatever the spring would bring, whatever the town would say. For now, they had this a warm cabin, good food, and the beginning of something neither had expected but both recognized as precious. Sometimes the best things came not from grand plans, but from simple needs, shelter from storms, healing for wounds, and someone to share the long winter nights. In the morning, there would be chores and challenges. But tonight, wrapped in Wade's arms while the wind howled outside, Olivia allowed herself to simply be grateful for this unexpected grace. Snow had trapped them in the cabin for 3 days now, turning the world beyond the windows into an endless white canvas. The silence was profound, not the awkward quiet of strangers forced together, but something deeper, richer. It wrapped around them like another blanket, comfortable and warm. Wade sat in his chair by the fire, the leather-bound volume of Byron open in his lap. He wasn't reading, though. Instead, he watched Olivia work at the table, mending one of his shirts with careful, precise stitches. The lamplight caught the auburn highlights in her dark hair, turned her focused expression into something that made his chest tight. She'd been here 2 weeks now, and the cabin had transformed. Not in grand ways, she hadn't moved furniture or hung curtains, but there were subtle changes everywhere he looked. The shelves organized with a logic he could follow. Fresh bread cooling on the windowsill. His shirts mended before he even realized they needed it. The constant smell of coffee and something baking. Home. She'd made it a home. "You're staring," she said without looking up from her work. "Reading," he corrected, though they both knew it was a lie. She smiled, that small secret smile he'd begun to watch for. "Must be a fascinating poem." The subject matter improves with study. Now she did look up, color rising in her cheeks. "Wade Langston, are you flirting with me?" "Attempting to," he admitted, "though I'm likely out of practice." She set down her sewing, studying him with those clear gray eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. "You do just fine." They held each other's gaze across the small space, and Wade felt something shift between them, like ice beginning its spring thaw. These past days had been a dance of careful courtesy and growing warmth. They still slept on opposite sides of the bed. Though they woke each morning wrapped around each other like vines, they still maintained proper distance during the day, though their hands brushed more often than accident could account for. "Tell me about her," Olivia said suddenly. "The woman who left." Wade closed the book slowly, considering he'd never spoken of Catherine to anyone, had locked that failure away with other things that hurt to examine. But Olivia had trusted him with her own pain, and trust deserved trust in return. "Catherine Morrison," he began, "daughter of a banker from Philadelphia. We met when I was there selling cattle. She was refined, delicate, everything a frontier man thinks he wants in a wife." Olivia picked up her sewing again, but he could tell she was listening intently. She had ideas about what life out here would be like. Read too many novels, I think. Thought it would be an adventure, wide open spaces, noble cowboys, building something together. The reality, he gestured around the cabin. The reality was different. What happened? She lasted 3 weeks. Cried every night. The isolation terrified her. No neighbors to visit, no shops, no society. The work was harder than she'd imagined. When the first real snowstorm hit, she looked at me like I'd trapped her in hell itself. So she left. Wade stared into the fire, remembering. Took the stage back to town and then the train east. Last I heard, she married a shopkeeper in Philadelphia. Has 3 children and a house with proper wallpaper. Do you regret it? He considered the question. I regret that I hurt her. Regret that I couldn't be what she needed. But no, I don't regret that it ended. We were wrong for each other from the start. I was trying to be someone I wasn't, and so was she. Olivia set aside the mended shirt and moved to sit on the floor near his chair, her back against his leg. It was the closest she'd voluntarily come to him during waking hours, and he had to resist the urge to touch her hair. Theodore wanted me to be delicate, she said quietly. Wanted me to pour tea and play piano and host dinner parties. I tried, for a while, took lessons, learned to embroider, practiced walking with books on my head. But then the opportunity came to work the cattle drive, and I took it without thinking, like my true nature just burst free. Thank God for that, Wade murmured. She tilted her head back to look at him. You don't wish I were more refined? He laughed. Couldn't help it. Olivia, I've seen you handle a kitchen knife like a surgeon, organize my pantry with military precision, and face down a blizzard without flinching. Refinement is just another word for useless, far as I can tell. She was quiet for a long moment, then stood and moved to the window. The snow had stopped falling, but the world outside remained buried, drifts reaching halfway up the walls. "We're truly trapped," she said. "Does that frighten you?" She turned to face him, and there was something in her expression he couldn't quite read. "No, that's what frightens me, that I'm not frightened at all." Wade set aside his book and rose, moving to stand beside her at the window. They stood close, but not touching, watching their reflections ghosted in the glass. "First winter I spent here alone," he said. "I nearly went mad from the silence. Talked to the horses, the chickens, myself, read every book I owned 3 times. Spring came like salvation. And now I'm afraid of spring." She turned to him, question in her eyes. "When the snow melts," he explained, "you'll have choices again. The trail will be clear. You could go anywhere, do anything. Why would you stay?" "Wade?" She said his name like it meant something. "Where would I go back to Missouri to beg forgiveness? To another town where I'd be the woman who cooked for cowboys? To another cattle drive where I'd always be separate, always apart?" "You could go anywhere. You're strong enough." "I am strong enough," she agreed. "Strong enough to recognize home when I find it." The word hung between them like a promise. Wade reached out slowly, giving her time to step away, and touched her cheek. She leaned into his hand, eyes fluttering closed. "Olivia," he said, and then couldn't find more words. She opened her eyes, and what he saw there made his breath catch. "I know," she whispered. "I know." He should kiss her. Everything in him wanted to kiss her. But something held him back, not propriety, not fear, but a sense that this moment was too important to rush. Instead, he pulled her against him, tucking her head beneath his chin, and they stood holding each other while the wind picked up outside. "Read to me," she asked after a while, her voice muffled against his chest. So he did. They settled by the fire, Olivia in her chair with her sewing, Wade in his with Wordsworth this time, but the words that usually transported him seemed pale compared to the reality of her presence. He found himself watching her over the book, the way she bit her lip when concentrating on a difficult stitch, how the firelight painted gold across her skin. At one point she pricked her finger, making a small sound of annoyance. Without thinking, he reached for her hand, bringing the injured finger to his lips. The gesture was instinctive, intimate, and they both froze. "I should," Olivia began. "Yes," he agreed, though neither moved. They stayed like that, her hand in his. The small hurt kissed better, until the fire burned low and darkness pressed against the windows. When they finally retired, they lay in their accustomed places, but the space between them felt charged with possibility. In the depths of the night, Olivia woke to find tears on her cheeks. She couldn't say why she was crying happiness, fear, the overwhelming sense of standing on the edge of something vast and permanent. Wade stirred beside her. "What is it?" he asked, voice rough with sleep. "Nothing. Everything." She turned toward him in the darkness. "I've never felt this before. Like I'm exactly where I'm meant to be. It terrifies me." He was quiet so long she thought he'd fallen back asleep. Then he spoke, carefully, like he was picking his way across uncertain ground. "I loved Catherine, or thought I did, but it was like trying to hold water. The harder I gripped, the faster it ran through my fingers. What I feel for you, it's different, solid, like bedrock." "Wade, I'm not asking for anything," he said quickly. "Just needed you to know, in case the snow melts tomorrow and you decide." She kissed him, simply leaned across the careful distance and pressed her lips to his, silencing his fears with the most elemental answer she could give. He made a sound surprise, perhaps, or relief, and then his good arm came around her, pulling her closer. It was a careful kiss, tentative, as if they were both afraid of breaking something precious. When they parted, Olivia could feel his heart racing beneath her palm. "I'm not going anywhere," she whispered. "Not when the snow melts, not when spring comes, not ever. Do you understand?" "I'm beginning to," he said, and kissed her again. They lay entwined after that, trading soft words and softer kisses, learning the shape of this new thing between them. When dawn came, painting the snow-buried world in shades of pearl and rose, they were still awake, still marveling at the unexpected gift of finding each other. "What happens now?" Olivia asked, tracing patterns on his chest through his shirt. "Now," Wade said, pressing a kiss to her hair. "We wait for the snow to melt. We tend the stock and bake bread and read poetry. We learn each other. And when spring comes, when spring comes, I'll court you proper. Take you to town dances, bring you flowers, all the things I should have done from the start." She laughed, the sound bright as morning. "Wade Langston, we've been sharing a bed for 2 weeks. We've weathered a blizzard together. I've mended your shirts and you've read me poetry. If that's not courting, I don't know what is." "Fair point," he conceded. "Then when spring comes, I'll marry you. If you'll have me." "Is that a proposal?" "It's a promise," he said, "a declaration of intent. The proposal will come with a ring and probably some stammering." "I'll look forward to the stammering," she said, and kissed him once more. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days, setting the snow ablaze with light. Inside, two people who had found each other against all odds held tight and began to believe in the possibility of forever. The silence that wrapped around them now was different than before, not the quiet of strangers or even friends, but the peaceful hush of two souls recognizing their match. In the spring there would be challenges, gossip, the business of building a life together. But here, now, in their snowbound sanctuary, there was only this: the crackle of the fire, the whisper of promises, and the solid certainty of love taking root. The fifth night brought a different kind of tension to the cabin. Olivia had been restless all day, distracted while cooking, nearly burning the cornbread, something that hadn't happened since her first week on the cattle drive. Wade noticed. Of course, he noticed everything about her these days, from the way she hummed while kneading dough to how she twisted her hair when thinking. "Something troubling you?" he asked over supper, watching her push beans around her plate. "No," she said quickly. Then, "Yes, I don't know." He waited, patient as always. It was one of the things she loved about him, how he made space for words to find their way out instead of pulling them forth. "It's foolish," she finally said. "Being here like this, it's made me forget myself, forget what's proper. Nothing improper has happened between us." "No, but—" She set down her fork, frustrated. "I wanted to— That's the trouble. I lie there at night beside you and I want—" She broke off, color flooding her cheeks. Wade went very still. When he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "What do you want, Olivia?" She looked at him then, really looked at him, at this man who read poetry and gentled horses, who'd opened his home without questions, who held her through the night but never pushed for more. "You," she said simply. "I want you." The words hung between them like struck bells. Wade pushed back from the table, stood, then seemed uncertain what to do next. He moved to the window, staring out at the darkness. "I'm not a man who takes things lightly," he said finally. "When I touch a woman, when I touch you, it means something. It means everything. I know that." "Do you—" He turned to face her. "Because once we cross that line, there's no going back. I won't be able to let you go. Olivia, not come spring, not ever." She rose and moved to him, stopping just out of reach. "I already can't go. Don't you understand? My heart is here, has been since that first night when you couldn't eat your stew and I knew what you needed without asking." "That was you seeing a practical problem," he said, but his voice was rough. "This is different." "No," she said firmly. "It's exactly the same. I see what you need. You see what I need. The only difference is we're both too scared to reach for it." "I'm not scared," he protested. "Then what are you—" "Careful," he said. "I'm being careful with you. Because you deserve that. You deserve courting and promises and wedding rings, not a snowbound cabin and a man who's forgotten how to be gentle." "You're the gentlest man I've ever known," Olivia said, and finally closed the distance between them. "Every poem you read, every blanket you tuck around me, every time you could have taken more but didn't, that's all gentleness. Wade, that's all courting." She reached up, touched his face. He closed his eyes, leaning into her palm like a man starved for touch. "Olivia," he said, her name a prayer and a warning. "I'm not Catherine," she said softly. "I won't wake up one day and realize this life is too hard. I already know it's hard. I've lived hard. This what we have, this is the easy part. This is the reward for all that hard living." He opened his eyes, and what she saw there made her breath catch. Love. Yes, but also hunger, barely leashed. "If we do this." "When," she corrected. "When we do this." "When we do this," he agreed. "It won't be some hasty fumbling in the dark. You deserve better. We both do." She smiled, sudden and bright. "Then show me better." He kissed her then, different from their careful kisses of the past nights. This had intent behind it, purpose. His good arm pulled her tight against him while his injured one curved carefully around her waist. She could feel the restraint in him, the careful control, and it made her bold. "Your shoulder," she murmured against his lips. "Damn my shoulder," he growled. But when she laughed, he gentled. "We'll be careful," he amended. "I'll be careful." They moved to the bed slowly, pausing to bank the fire, and to blow out all but one lamp. Olivia's hands shook as she unpinned her hair, letting it fall in dark waves around her shoulders. Wade watched from beside the bed, his expression reverent. "I've imagined this," he admitted. "Your hair down. Thought about it while you were cooking, while you were mending, while you slept beside me. Felt like a thief, stealing those thoughts." "Not stealing," she said, moving to him. "I give them freely, all my thoughts, all of me." What followed was a careful exploration, a slow discovery of each other. Wade true to his word about being gentle, treating her like something precious but not fragile. Olivia found herself leading at times, showing him without words that she was no porcelain doll to shatter at first touch. She was prairie strong, trail hardened, and she wanted him to know it. "I've never," he said at one point, then stopped. "Never what?" "Never felt like this, like I could fly apart at the seams and come together stronger." She understood. Everything before Theodore's polite kisses, the careful distance of her engagement seemed like shadows compared to this. This was real, solid, overwhelming in its rightness. Later, they lay entwined, the lamp burning low. Olivia traced patterns on Wade's chest, marveling at the freedom to touch him. He played with her hair, winding strands around his fingers like he was memorizing the texture. "No regrets?" he asked, echoing their first night. "Only one," she said, and felt him tense. "That we waited so long." He laughed, the sound rumbling through his chest. 5 weeks of knowing each other. Some would say that's scandalously fast. "Some would say a lot of things about us," Olivia pointed out. "A woman who cooks for cowboys, a man who reads poetry. We're already the subject of gossip." "Let them gossip," Wade said firmly. "They don't know what we have here." "What do we have?" she asked. Not because she didn't know, but because she wanted to hear him say it. He was quiet for a moment, choosing his words. "We have 2 people who've been shaped by loneliness, who know how to stand alone, but we're choosing to stand together instead. That's not weakness, that's the strongest thing there is." "You should have been a poet yourself," she murmured. "I leave that to better men. I'm just a rancher who got lucky enough to have you walk into his life." "Ride," she corrected. "I rode into your life on a mule cart. Remember, not very poetic." "I don't know," he said thoughtfully. "Woman fleeing a broken engagement, arriving in a frontier town as the first snow falls, finding shelter with a wounded rancher who reads Byron by firelight sounds like poetry to me." They talked through the night, sharing stories they'd held back before. Wade told her about his childhood in Texas, his father's death that drove him north, the years of building this ranch board by board. Olivia shared memories of her mother, who died when she was 15, leaving her to keep house for a father who loved her but didn't know how to say it. "He would have liked you," she said. "He respected people who worked hard and spoke plain." "Would he have approved of this?" Wade gestured to their entwined state. "He would have asked if you made me happy," Olivia said. "When I said yes, he would have shaken your hand and asked if you needed help with the barn." Practical man. Like someone else I know. Dawn was breaking, painting the snow-covered world in shades of gold and rose. Neither had slept, but Olivia felt more rested than she had in months. The constant tension of the past weeks, the careful distance, the controlled want had dissolved, leaving peace in its wake. "We should get up," Wade said without conviction. "Stock needs feeding." "In a minute," Olivia said, burrowing closer. "The chickens." "Can wait." She kissed him quiet, then pulled back to look at him seriously. "Wade, what happens when the snow melts when we go back to town?" "We get married," he said simply. "Soon as possible. I'll not have you spending another night under my roof without my ring on your finger. Last night was, call it a promise, a down payment on forever." "That's very proper of you," she teased. "I have my moments." He grew serious again. "I mean it. Olivia, I want to do right by you. Want the whole town to know you're mine and I'm yours, legal and binding. Even if they whisper about the rushed wedding count backwards from the birth of our first child." "Let them count," he said fiercely. "They'll find their math doesn't work, and maybe that'll teach them to mind their own business." "And if it does work?" she asked quietly. "If there's a child from last night?" His hand splayed across her stomach, possessive and gentle. "Then we'll have a head start on the family I want to build with you. Either way, I'm the winner." She kissed him for that, long and deep, until the chickens' complaints grew too loud to ignore. They rose reluctantly, dressing with new awareness of each other. Every glance held weight now. Every accidental touch sparked recognition. As Olivia prepared breakfast and Wade saw to the animals, she found herself humming not nervously, but with pure contentment. Through the window, she watched him work, favoring his shoulder less each day. Soon he'd be fully healed, and she'd have no practical reason to stay. But now she had every reason that mattered. When he came back in, stomping snow from his boots, she had coffee ready and breakfast on the table. He caught her around the waist, kissed her thoroughly, then sat down to eat like it was any other morning. But his hand found hers between bites, and his eyes held promises of 1,000 mornings just like this. "I love you," she said suddenly, surprising herself with the words. He set down his fork, squeezed her hand. "I love you too. Have since you handed me that plate of stew over cornbread and didn't ask why a grown man couldn't feed himself." "That long ago." "Maybe before," he admitted. "Maybe from the moment you walked into that boarding house dining room, tall and proud and not apologizing for a damn thing. Just took me a while to find the words for it. And now you've found them." "Now I've found them," he agreed. "And I plan to keep saying them, every day, until you're sick of hearing them." "Never," she promised. "Never." Outside, the sun climbed higher, starting the slow work of melting snow. But inside the cabin, Two people who'd found each other against all odds sat close, hands linked, and began the even slower, sweeter work of building a life together. Spring would come with its challenges and changes, but for now, this was enough love spoken aloud, promises made, and the certainty that whatever came next, they'd face it together. The snow began its retreat on a Thursday, revealing patches of brown earth like promises of spring. Wade's shoulder had healed almost completely, and they both knew their isolated winter idyll was coming to an end. The trail to town would be passable within days. "We should go tomorrow," Wade said over breakfast, watching the steady drip of snowmelt from the eaves. "Need supplies, and I want to speak to Reverend Morrison about arrangements." Olivia felt her stomach flutter, part excitement, part apprehension. The cabin had been their sanctuary, but now they'd have to face the world beyond, with all its judgments and assumptions. "What will people say?" she asked, not because she cared overmuch, but because she wanted to be prepared. "The truth, likely, that you've been living up here with me unchaperoned for near 6 weeks." He reached across the table, took her hand. "Also the truth that I aim to marry you quick as possible and spend the rest of my life proving they were wrong to judge you." She squeezed his fingers. "I'm not worried about judgment. I've been judged before and survived. I'm worried about him. Marcus. He was asking questions before. What if he's still in town?" Wade's expression darkened. "Then he'll learn that frontier men protect what's theirs. With words, if possible. With more, if necessary." The next morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of day that made the remaining snow sparkle like scattered diamonds. They loaded the wagon carefully. Olivia had a list of supplies they needed, and Wade had business at the bank and the feed store. She wore her best dress, the burgundy wool she'd saved for special occasions, and tried not to feel like she was girding for battle. The ride to town was different from that first journey, where before she'd been focused on leaving her past behind. Now she was conscious of the future they were riding toward. Wade kept glancing at her, small smiles playing at the corners of his mouth. "What?" she finally asked. "Just thinking how different this is from the last time I brought a woman to town," he said. "Catherine cried the whole way, said the road was too rough, the air too cold. You look like you're ready to take on the world." "Just Morrow Creek," she corrected. "The world can wait until tomorrow." They heard the town before they saw it, the ring of the blacksmith's hammer. Dogs barking, the general bustle of commerce. As they crested the final hill, Olivia straightened her spine. Whatever came next, she'd meet it standing tall. The first person they encountered was Mrs. Thornberry, sweeping the boarding house steps. The older woman's eyes widened as she took in Olivia's presence beside Wade on the wagon seat. "Miss Bennett," she called. "Land sakes, we wondered what had become of you, when that city fellow said you'd taken employment at the Ridge." "Good morning, Mrs. Thornberry," Olivia replied calmly. "I hope you've been well." The landlady's sharp eyes moved between them, noting their closeness. The easy way Wade helped Olivia down from the wagon. "I see," she said slowly. Then, surprising them both, she smiled. "About time someone brought some life back to that ranch. You'll be needing supplies for a proper kitchen, I expect." "Yes, ma'am," Olivia agreed, relief washing through her. "Chen's got in some new goods from Denver. Tell him I sent you. He'll give you a fair price." Mrs. Thornberry paused, then added quietly, "And if anyone gives you trouble, you send them to me. I've got a few things to say about folks who judge without knowing." News traveled fast in a small town. By the time they reached Chen's Mercantile, a small crowd had gathered, pretending to go about their business while watching the newcomers. Olivia kept her head high, her hand resting lightly on Wade's arm. Inside the store, Mr. Chen greeted them warmly. "Miss Bennett, Mr. Langston, good to see you both. How did the winter treat you?" "Well enough," Wade replied. But his eyes were on the back of the store where Marcus Whitman stood examining a display of rifles. Marcus turned slowly, that familiar sneer already forming. Well, the prodigal woman returns, and with her, employer. He made the last word sound dirty. Whitman, Wade said evenly. Still in town, I see. I had business to conclude. Seems I was right to stay. Marcus moved closer, his pale eyes fixed on Olivia. Theodore will be fascinated to hear about your situation. Living unmarried with a man all winter, my dear. You've quite outdone yourself. That's enough, Wade said, stepping forward. But Olivia put a hand on his arm, holding him back. Let him talk, she said calmly. Mr. Whitman has always been talented at making something out of nothing. Nothing, Marcus laughed, an ugly sound. You call sharing a cabin with a man for weeks nothing. What would you call it then? I'd call it employment, Olivia said clearly, her voice carrying through the store. Mr. Langston hired me to cook while he recovered from an injury. I performed my duties with professionalism and integrity. Is that what they're calling it now? Marcus's sneer widened. And I suppose you'll claim nothing improper happened, that you maintained perfect propriety while snowbound together. Wade moved then, faster than Marcus expected. He didn't strike the man, simply backed him against the counter with his presence alone. You're speaking about my future wife, he said, low and dangerous. Choose your next words very carefully. Future wife, Marcus sputtered. You can't be serious. Dead serious. Reverend Morrison is posting the banns this Sunday. We'll be married as soon as legally possible. Wade leaned closer. And if I hear you've written one word to anyone about Miss Bennett that isn't the truth, that she's a woman of integrity who saved my ranch and my life this winter, well, the trail to town can be treacherous. Man could get lost, permanently. Mr. Chen cleared his throat. Perhaps Mr. Whitman would be more comfortable shopping elsewhere. I believe Johnson's store on the other side of town carries rifles. Marcus looked around, realized the entire store had heard the exchange. Mrs. Patterson from the boarding house, the Svensson brothers who ranched north of Wade, even Jake Morrison from the sagebrush, all watching with expressions that ranged from curiosity to outright hostility toward the outsider who'd insulted one of their own. This isn't over, Marcus said, but he was already backing toward the door. Yes, it is, Olivia said firmly. Whatever you think you know about me, whatever stories you want to tell, they don't matter. I know who I am. This town knows who I am. Most importantly, Wade knows who I am. That's all that counts. Marcus fled then, the bell above the door jangling his retreat. A moment of silence followed. Then Mrs. Patterson spoke up. About time someone put that pompous fool in his place. Never did like how he looked at the young women in town, like we were cattle at auction. City men. One of the Svensson brothers agreed. Think they own the world. Jake Morrison stepped forward, grinning. So you're getting married? This calls for a celebration. Drinks at the sagebrush tonight. My treat. And just like that, the tide turned. People crowded forward with congratulations, questions about wedding plans, offers of help. Olivia found herself swept into the warm embrace of frontier practicality these people judged by actions, not rumors, and her actions all winter had spoken clearly. Later, while Wade conducted business at the bank, Olivia found herself back at the boarding house, sitting in Mrs. Thornberry's kitchen with a cup of tea. I worried about you, the older woman admitted. When you left so sudden with Wade, he's a good man, but that ranch is isolated, and after what happened with Catherine... I'm not Catherine, Olivia said gently. No, you're not. I saw that the first night, when you made that plate for him. Saw how he looked at you too, like he'd been starving and didn't know it until food appeared. Mrs. Thornberry smiled. You'll do well up there. That ranch has been waiting for a woman like you. A woman who cooks for cowboys? Olivia asked wryly. A woman who sees what needs doing and does it. Who doesn't need the whole world watching to know her own worth? The landlady patted her hand. Now, about the wedding, I assume you'll need a dress. By the time Wade collected her, Olivia had been absorbed into the town's network of women. Plans were already forming Mrs. Patterson had fabric that would make a fine wedding dress. Mrs. Chen knew a seamstress who could work quickly. And Mrs. Thornberry insisted on hosting a small reception after the ceremony. Survive the interrogation? Wade asked as they loaded their supplies. They were very kind, Olivia said, still slightly overwhelmed. I didn't expect... What? That people would be happy for us. He helped her onto the wagon seat. You fed half this town good meals at fair prices. You think they'd forget that because some city dandy spreads gossip? As they drove out of town, Olivia looked back at the collection of buildings that had seemed so unwelcoming just weeks before. Now she saw faces in windows, hands raised in farewell, a place where she could belong. Do you think Marcus will write to Theodore? She asked. Does it matter if he does? She considered this. No, it doesn't. That life feels like something I dreamed once. This is real. Wade reached over, took her hand. This is real. He agreed. And in 2 weeks, it'll be legal too. Think you can stand living with me that much longer? I think I can manage, she said, leaning against his shoulder. Though you might have to read more poetry. I'm developing quite a taste for it. Woman after my own heart, he murmured. I should hope so, she replied. Since you're stuck with me now. As they climbed back toward the ridge, Olivia felt something settle in her chest. The town had accepted them, would support them. Marcus could write whatever letters he chose, they would change nothing. She'd found her place, her person, her purpose. Everything else was just noise. The cabin came into view as the sun began its descent, painting the logs golden. Home, she thought, and knew that word would never mean anywhere else. Wade must have felt it too, because he pulled the horses to a stop just to look. No regrets, he asked one more time. Only one, she said, echoing her words from nights before. That we have to wait 2 more weeks for the wedding. He laughed, clicked to the horses. Patience, woman. I've waited my whole life for you. 2 weeks more won't kill me. Speak for yourself, she muttered, making him laugh again. They unloaded the supplies together, working in easy rhythm. Tomorrow would bring chores and challenges, wedding plans and winter's final struggles. But tonight they had each other, their cabin, and the knowledge that they'd faced the world and won. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Olivia stood in the doorway of the cabin, watching Wade tend the horses. In 2 weeks, she'd be Mrs. Wade Langston. But she was already home. The rest was just paperwork. Coming in, Wade called. Coffee's getting cold. Coming, she answered, and closed the door on the outside world, ready to begin the rest of their lives. Looking at the outline for Part 8. The dance. Key elements to include: a harvest dance is announced. Olivia doesn't plan to attend. Wade shows up at the boarding house in his best shirt. Hand out, no asking, just gesture. They dance in quiet rhythm, his hand at her waist. Her ex's cousin Marcus tries to interrupt. Wade doesn't fight, just raises her hand and keeps dancing. This is after their return to town and wedding announcement. So they're engaged now. I need to write about 1,500 to 1,800 words capturing this romantic dance scene and the confrontation with Marcus. The news of the harvest dance spread through Morrow Creek like wildfire. Though spring was just beginning to assert itself, the town council had decided to celebrate surviving another hard winter with an early gathering. Posters appeared on the mercantile window and outside the sagebrush. Spring harvest dance, Saturday night, all welcome. Olivia heard about it while picking up supplies at Chen's. 2 weeks after their confrontation with Marcus, their wedding was set for the following Sunday, and she'd been focused on preparations the dress misses. Patterson was altering. The small reception misses. Thornberry insisted on hosting, the 100 tiny details that seemed to multiply daily. "You'll be attending, of course," Mrs. Chen said, wrapping Olivia's purchases in brown paper. "Every engaged couple in town will be there. It's tradition." I hadn't really thought about it, Olivia admitted. Truth was, she'd never been one for dances. On the cattle drive, the cowboys had sometimes played fiddle around the campfire, but she'd always been too tired or too wary to join in. And in Missouri, the formal dances had been exercises in precision and propriety that left her feeling clumsy and out of place. "Oh, but you must come," Mrs. Patterson chimed in from behind her. "It'll be your first official appearance as an engaged couple. Besides, that dress we're working on needs a test run before the wedding." Olivia smiled politely but made no commitment. When she returned to the ridge that evening, she mentioned the dance to Wade over supper. "Could be nice," he said carefully, reading her reluctance. "But we don't have to go if you'd rather not." "I'm not much of a dancer," she confessed. "Theodore tried to teach me the proper steps, but I always felt like a horse trying to waltz." Wade chuckled. "Can't picture you clumsy at anything. You've never seen me in a ballroom. Good thing we don't have any of those in Morrow Creek, then." He reached across the table, took her hand. "Olivia, we don't have to go. But if you're worried about the dancing, I should tell you that frontier dances aren't like city ones. No one's counting steps or judging form. It's just people moving to music, celebrating being alive." She squeezed his fingers. "I'll think about it." But as Saturday approached, she found more and more reasons to avoid the dance. There was mending to finish, bread to bake for Sunday's reception, a dozen small tasks that suddenly seemed urgent. She was staying in town at Mrs. Thornberry's for appearance's sake until the wedding, and when Saturday evening arrived, she sat in her small room, listening to the sounds of preparation throughout the boarding house. Other boarders were getting ready. She could hear laughter, the splash of water, boots being polished. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Soon, lanterns would be lit at the town hall, musicians would tune their instruments, and couples would take to the floor. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, expecting Mrs. Thornberry. But it was Wade who opened the door, and Olivia's breath caught. He wore his best shirt, white cotton, carefully pressed, and dark trousers. His hair was still damp from washing, curling slightly at his collar. He'd shaved, revealing the strong line of his jaw. But it was his expression that stopped her heart, nervous and determined and tender all at once. He didn't speak, simply stood in her doorway and extended his hand, palm up, waiting. "Wade," she began, "I'm not dressed for—" He shook his head slightly, hand still extended. His eyes said everything. "Trust me. Come with me. Let me show you." Olivia looked down at her self-plain blue dress, everyday boots, hair in its usual working braid. Then she looked at Wade, patient and sure, offering not just a dance but something more. Acceptance, partnership, a declaration that she was enough, exactly as she was. She placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and calloused and perfect. He drew her to her feet, out the door, down the stairs. Mrs. Thornberry watched from the parlor with a knowing smile, but said nothing. Out into the spring evening they went, the air soft with the promise of growing things. The town hall glowed with lantern light, music spilling from the open doors, fiddle and guitar, and someone playing spoons. Couples moved past the windows, shadows dancing against the light. Wade paused at the bottom of the steps. "We can still turn back," he offered quietly. "No," Olivia said, surprising herself with the firmness of it. "I want this. I want to dance with you where everyone can see. Want them to know I'm yours and you're mine." He smiled then, that rare full smile that transformed his weathered face. "That's my girl." Inside, the hall was warm with bodies and laughter. Couples of all ages filled the floor, the Svensson brothers with their wives. Jake Morrison dancing with a schoolteacher, even stern Mr. Chen moving carefully with his tiny wife. The music was lively but not frantic, a melody that invited movement rather than demanded it. People noticed their entrance, how could they not? But the looks were mostly friendly, approving. Wade led her to a clear spot on the floor, turned to face her, and suddenly Olivia understood why he hadn't asked, hadn't spoken. Words would have given her room to refuse, to list all the reasons this was a bad idea. But his silent invitation had spoken straight to her heart. He placed one hand at her waist, took her other hand in his, and they began to move. It was nothing like the elaborate dances Theodore had tried to teach her. This was simpler, more natural, just swaying together, finding the rhythm not just of the music, but of each other. Wade's hand at her waist was warm through the fabric of her dress, steadying without constraining. He guided without forcing, led without dominating. "You're doing fine," he murmured near her ear. "Just follow me." And she did, for the first time in her life. Dancing felt natural. Right. Maybe because she wasn't thinking about steps or watching for judgment. Maybe because Wade moved like he did everything else, with quiet confidence and unwavering focus on what mattered. Or maybe because this wasn't really about dancing at all. They'd been moving together for several songs when Olivia became aware of a disturbance near the door. Marcus Whitman had entered, dressed in his city finery that looked overdone among the simple clothing of the townspeople. His eyes found them immediately, and his face darkened. "He's here," Olivia whispered. "I know," Wade replied calmly. "Don't look at him. Look at me." She did, finding steady assurance in his prairie grass eyes. Around them, other dancers had noticed Marcus too, and a subtle shift occurred. Couples moved closer to Wade and Olivia, a protective circle forming without words. Frontier solidarity against an outsider who'd proven himself unwelcome. Marcus pushed through the crowd, his face flushed with drink and anger. "Excuse me," he said loudly as he reached them. "I believe it's customary to allow others to dance with the lady." Wade didn't stop moving, didn't even look at Marcus. He simply raised Olivia's hand higher, spun her gently, and continued their dance. The gesture was elegant in its simplicity, a clear message that nothing and no one would interrupt this moment. "I'm speaking to you, Langston," Marcus said, louder now. The music faltered as musicians noticed the confrontation. Still, Wade danced, keeping Olivia moving in the sudden quiet. His hand at her waist was steady, his eyes never leaving hers. "Trust me," that look said. "Stay with me." "This is ridiculous," Marcus sputtered. "You can't simply ignore him. Mr. Whitman." Jake Morrison stepped forward, flanked by the Svensson brothers. "I believe you've had enough excitement for one evening. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at your lodgings." "This is a public dance," Marcus protested. "I have every right." "Rights end where trouble begins." "Mr. Chen said quietly, appearing at Jake's shoulder. "And you, sir, are trouble." Marcus looked around, seemed to realize for the first time that the entire hall had turned against him. Every face showed the same message: "You are not welcome here." "Play on," someone called to the musicians. "This is a dance, not a debate." The fiddle resumed, tentative at first, then with growing confidence. Other couples began moving again, but the protective circle around Wade and Olivia remained. Marcus stood isolated, his city clothes and city manners marking him as surely as a brand. "This isn't over," he said, but the words lacked force. "Yes, it is, Mrs." Thornberry announced, pushing through the crowd like a small battleship. "Mr. Whitman, you've overstayed your welcome in Morrow Creek. I'll expect you to settle your bill and vacate your room by morning. Tom Brennan runs a freight wagon to the railroad on Mondays. I suggest you be on it." Faced with the united front of the town, Marcus had no choice but to retreat. He left to a scattered round of applause, and the dance resumed in earnest. Wade finally looked away from Olivia, glancing around at their neighbors with something like wonder. "Thank you," he said simply. "Take care of our own." Jake replied with a grin. "Now quit talking and dance with your lady. You're making the rest of us look bad." The tension broken. Laughter rippled through the hall. The music picked up tempo, and Wade spun Olivia again, making her laugh too. They danced through 3 more songs, each one easier than the last, until she felt like she could float. "I think I understand now," she said as they swayed together during a slower tune. "Understand what?" "Why people dance. It's not about the steps at all. Is it?" "No," he agreed, pulling her slightly closer. "It's about this being together, moving together, telling the world without words that you belong to each other." "I like that," she murmured. "I like belonging to you." "And I to you," he replied. "Always." They stayed until the last dance, when tradition demanded all engaged and married couples take the floor, as they moved together in the lantern light, surrounded by their neighbors and friends. Olivia marveled at how much had changed. 6 weeks ago, she'd arrived in this town alone and unwanted. Now she was part of something, a community, a couple, a future that grew brighter with each passing day. When the music finally ended and couples began departing, Wade walked her back to the boarding house. At the door, he lifted her hand to his lips, a courtly gesture that made her heart flutter. "Thank you for dancing with me," he said formally. "Thank you for not asking," she replied. "If you'd asked, I might have said no." "I know," he smiled. "That's why I didn't ask." "Wade Langston, you're sneakier than you appear." "I have my moments. Good night, soon to be Mrs. Langston." "Good night, Mr. Langston." She watched him walk away. This man who read poetry and danced without asking and faced down trouble with quiet strength. In 1 week, she'd be his wife. But tonight, in front of the whole town, she'd become something else, his partner, in every dance that mattered. Inside, Mrs. Thornberry was waiting with hot tea and knowing looks. "Well," she demanded. "Well, what?" Olivia asked innocently. "Don't play coy with me. Young woman, the whole town saw you two out there, dancing like you were the only people in the world." "It felt that way," Olivia admitted. "Like nothing else existed but the music and his hand at my waist." "That's how it should feel," the older woman said with satisfaction. "That's how you know it's real. Now, off to bed with you. We have a wedding to finish planning." As Olivia climbed the stairs to her room, she could still feel the ghost of Wade's hand at her waist, still hear the fiddle's sweet melody. She'd gone to the dance reluctantly and left it transformed. Tomorrow there would be final preparations, last details to arrange. But tonight, she'd danced with Wade Langston while the whole town watched and approved. Tonight, she'd been exactly where she belonged. The wedding came and went like a spring storm sudden, beautiful and transformative. Standing before Reverend Morrison in Mrs. Patterson's altered dress, with Wade's steady hand in hers and half the town bearing witness, Olivia felt the last chains of her old life fall away. When Wade kissed her as his wife, gentle but sure, the congregation erupted in celebration that could probably be heard clear to the ridge. Now, 3 days later, she stood in the kitchen of their cabin, truly theirs now, legally and spiritually kneading bread and humming. Through the window, she could see Wade working with a young mare, his movements fluid and confident. His shoulder had healed completely, leaving him no excuse for hired help, but neither of them had mentioned her leaving. Why would she? This was home. The morning had dawned quiet and golden, spring asserting itself with tiny green shoots pushing through the last patches of snow. She'd risen early from their bed, shared now without pretense or careful distance to start the coffee and begin the day's baking. But her mind kept wandering from the simple tasks, pulled by a restlessness she couldn't name. When the bread was set to rise, she found herself drawn to the door, then beyond it, walking the worn path toward the small garden plot Wade had helped her prepare. The soil was still cold, too early for planting, but she could envision it rows of vegetables, herbs for cooking, perhaps some flowers just for the joy of them, building something that would last. Planning your empire. She turned to find Wade behind her, moving with that quiet way he had of approaching, never startling, always announcing himself just before he arrived. "Just thinking," she said, "about permanence, about roots." He came to stand beside her, looking out over the land that rolled away toward the mountains. "Having second thoughts?" "No." The word came quick and sure. "The opposite. Actually, I've been running so long from Missouri, from expectations, from the idea that I had to be something I wasn't. Standing here now, I realize I don't want to run anymore. I want to build." "Then we'll build," he said simply. "Whatever you want. Garden, chicken coop, bigger kitchen." "A life," she interrupted. "I want to build a life here with you." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "Olivia, there's something I need to tell you. About the ranch, about why I've held on to it so hard, even when it would have been easier to sell." She turned to face him fully, recognizing the serious set of his shoulders. "My father started this place," he continued. "Came out here with nothing but determination and a dream of land that was his own. He worked himself into an early grave, making it successful. And when he died, I promised I'd keep it going. Not just the ranch, but what it represented. Independence, honest work, a place where a man or woman could be judged by what they did, not where they came from." "And Catherine wanted you to give that up," Olivia said, understanding. She saw it as stubbornness, said I was choosing dead dreams over living people. He smiled ruefully. "Maybe I was. For a while. It's easy to hide behind duty, to say you're honoring the past when really you're just afraid of the future. And now I see it different. This place isn't about the past anymore. It's about tomorrow, next season, the years to come. It's about the life we're building together." He took her hands, work-rough palms against work-rough palms. "I want you to know that this is yours too, not just as my wife, but as my partner. Every decision, every plan, every dream, we make them together." Olivia squeezed his hands, feeling the weight and wonder of what he was offering. Not just a home, but true partnership. "Together," she agreed. They were interrupted by the sound of a wagon approaching, unusual enough to draw their attention. As it came into view, Olivia recognized Mrs. Thornberry's distinctive bonnet, with Tom Brennan's boy driving. "Now what?" Wade muttered, but he was smiling. Mrs. Thornberry alighted from the wagon with surprising agility, carrying a covered basket. "Don't stand there gawping," she announced. "Tom, bring that crate." "Mrs. Thornberry," Olivia said, hurrying forward. "What brings you all the way out here?" "Wedding gifts," the older woman said briskly. "Folks wanted to make sure you were properly set up. Also, I have news you'll want to hear." She bustled into the cabin, nodding approval at its neat appearance. Tom struggled in with a wooden crate that clinked promisingly. Once settled at the table with coffee, Mrs. Thornberry began unpacking her basket preserves from Mrs. Chen, new dish towels from Mrs. Patterson, a small sewing kit from the school teacher. "The town's been talking," she said as she arranged the gifts. "About you two, about the dance, about that Whitman fellow." "Is he gone?" Wade asked. "On Monday's freight wagon, just as I told him, but not before he sent one last telegram." She pulled a piece of paper from her pocket, handed it to Olivia. "Sam at the telegraph office thought you should see it." Olivia read aloud, "Theodore abandoned woman married local rancher. Situation resolved. No further action required. M. Whitman." "Situation resolved," Wade repeated, shaking his head. "Like you were a problem to be solved." "In a way, I was," Olivia said thoughtfully. "To them, anyway. A woman who wouldn't fit their mold, wouldn't shrink herself to match their expectations. Marcus is right, the situation is resolved. Just not the way they expected. Well said, Mrs. Thornberry beamed. Now, Tom, stop lurking and bring in that crate. Careful, it's fragile. The crate, when opened, revealed dishes, real china dishes, painted with tiny blue flowers, delicate but practical. Olivia lifted a plate reverently, running her finger along the smooth edge. From the town, Mrs. Thornberry explained. Collection taken up at the dance. Folks remembered you eating off tin plates at the sagebrush. Figured a new bride deserved better. I don't, Olivia's voice caught. This is too much. Nonsense. You fed half this town good meals at fair prices. Treated everyone with respect whether they could pay or not. This is just folks saying thank you. She paused, then added slyly. Besides, Jake Morrison says business at the Sagebrush has dropped by half since you left. He's had to go back to serving his own terrible cooking. They laughed at that, and the moment of overwhelming emotion passed. But as Olivia carefully unwrapped each dish, she felt the weight of belonging settle around her like a warm shawl. These weren't just plates and cups, they were acceptance, welcome, community. After Mrs. Thornberry left with promises to visit again soon, Olivia and Wade stood in their kitchen, surveying the gifts spread on the table. From tin plates to china in just 2 months, Wade mused. That's quite a journey. The plates aren't what changed, Olivia pointed out. I'm still the same woman who cooked for cowboys and worked the cattle drives. But now you're home. He finished. Now you're ours. Makes all the difference. That evening, she served supper on the new dishes. Simple fare made special by the pretty plates. Wade noticed her handling them carefully, like they might shatter at a touch. They're meant to be used, he reminded her, not just admired. I know. It's just I've never had anything so fine. Even in Missouri, with Theodore, everything belonged to his family. Heirlooms I could use but never claim. She set down her fork, looked around the cabin that had become home. Everything here is mine, ours. It feels almost too good to be real. Wade reached across the table, covered her hand with his. It's real. Every bit of it. The good and the bad, the easy and the hard. We've earned this. Olivia, don't be afraid to claim it. She turned her hand palm up, lacing their fingers together. I'm learning. Give me time. All the time in the world. He promised. Later, as they cleaned the dishes together, her washing, him drying, the same easy rhythm they'd found that first night, Olivia found herself thinking about Marcus's telegram. Situation resolved. He'd meant it dismissively. But he was right. The situation of her life, uncertain for so long, had indeed resolved into something solid and sure. What are you smiling about? Wade asked, hanging the dish towel on its hook. Just thinking how wrong they all were. Theodore, his mother, Marcus. They thought I'd ruin myself by working the cattle drives, by choosing independence over propriety. But if I hadn't made that choice, I'd never have come here, never have met you. Their loss, my gain, Wade said simply. Our gain, she corrected. That's what partnership means. Right, shared losses, shared victories. Shared everything, he agreed, pulling her close. The good plates and the tin ones, the spring flowers and the winter storms. Poetry and hard work, she added. Silence and conversation. Burnt biscuits and perfect pies. You've never burnt biscuits in your life, he protested. Not yet, she conceded. But I'm bound to eventually. Will you still love me then? More, he said firmly. I'll love you more for being human, for making mistakes, for not being the perfect woman Theodore thought he wanted. Good, she said, standing on her toes to kiss him. Because I plan to be thoroughly imperfect. I'll track mud in the house and speak my mind at inappropriate times and forget to be delicate when delicate is called for. Promise, he asked against her lips. Promise, she confirmed. They stood there in their kitchen, surrounded by wedding gifts and spring twilight, holding each other in the future they were building. Outside, a meadowlark sang its evening song, and the wind carried the scent of growing things. The old life, the old expectations, the old fears all had been marked situation resolved and filed away. What remained was this: a man and woman who'd found each other against all odds, a cabin that had become a home, and all the tomorrows stretching ahead like an open road. Olivia had traveled far to reach this moment, from Missouri to the cattle drives to a snowbound ridge, but standing in Wade's arms, she knew the real journey was just beginning. "No more running," she murmured. "No more hiding," he agreed. "Just building, just living. Together. Always together." And in the growing darkness, with spring whispering promises through the windows and new dishes gleaming on the shelves, that seemed like more than enough. It seemed like everything. The morning mist clung to the ridge like a secret, wrapping the world in silver silence. Olivia stood at the window of the cabin, coffee cup warm in her hands, watching the sun paint the mountains in shades of rose and gold. 2 months had passed since the wedding, and spring had given way to early summer, bringing with it a bounty of growth and possibility. Behind her, she heard Wade stirring. The familiar sounds of morning boots on wood floors, the splash of water in the basin, the quiet groan of a man greeting another day of hard work. These sounds had become the rhythm of her life, as essential as heartbeat, as comforting as breath. "You're up early," he said, coming to stand behind her, arms circling her waist. "Couldn't sleep," she admitted, leaning back against his solid warmth. "Kept thinking about the letter." The letter had arrived yesterday, forwarded from the boarding house, bearing a Missouri postmark. Olivia hadn't opened it yet, some part of her reluctant to let that old world intrude on this new one. It sat on the kitchen table like an uninvited guest, demanding attention. "Want me to burn it?" Wade offered, only half joking. "No." She turned in his arms, looking up at his weathered face, still creased from sleep. "I need to read it. Need to close that door properly." He nodded, understanding. "After breakfast, then. Whatever it says, we'll face it together." They ate in companionable, quiet eggs from their own chickens, bread from yesterday's baking, coffee strong enough to wake the dead. The letter sat between them, but its presence had lost some of its power. Whatever words it contained, they couldn't touch what she and Wade had built. Finally, Olivia reached for it, broke the seal with steady fingers. The handwriting was familiar, not Theodore's careful script, but looser, more emotional. She read aloud. "Dear Olivia, I hope this letter finds you well. I am Theodore's sister, Margaret. You may remember we met once at a family dinner. I am writing against my mother's wishes, but conscience compels me. I wanted you to know that Theodore married Miss Constance Ashford last month. She is everything Mother wanted: delicate, refined, accomplished in all the proper arts. She faints at the slightest provocation and has never done a day's work in her life. Theodore seems satisfied. But I remember how you laughed at my brother's attempts at poetry, how you helped our cook when she burned her hand, how alive you seemed compared to the pale daughters of Mother's friends. When Marcus told us you'd married a rancher in Colorado, that you'd found a life that suited your nature, I was glad. Not everyone is meant for parlors and tea services. Some of us are meant for wider skies and harder ground. I envy your courage in choosing truth over comfort. Perhaps someday I'll find such courage myself. Be happy, Olivia. Be free. Margaret Whitman." Olivia set down the letter, surprised to find her eyes damp. "I barely remember her. A quiet girl, always reading in corners." "Sounds like someone else who deserves a chance at freedom," Wade observed. "Yes." Olivia folded the letter carefully. "Should I write back?" "That's for you to decide. But if you do, tell her there's always room in frontier towns for women who want more than parlors and fainting couches." Olivia smiled at that, the last weight of the past lifting from her shoulders. Theodore had his delicate bride. She had her poetry reading rancher. And somewhere in Missouri, a young woman dreamed of different choices. The world spun on, each finding their own path. "Come on," Wade said, pushing back from the table. "Daylight's wasting, and we've got work to do." They spent the morning in the garden, Olivia tending the vegetables that had grown strong in the mountain soil, Wade repairing the fence that kept the deer at bay. The sun climbed higher, warming their backs, drawing out the scent of sage and pine. This was partnership working side by side, building something that would last beyond seasons. Around noon, they heard horses approaching. Wade straightened, shading his eyes. "That's Ben Svensson's mare. Wonder what brings him up here." Ben Svensson dismounted, his usually jovial face serious. "Wade, Mrs. Langston, sorry to trouble you, but there's been an accident, rock slide on the Turner place. Old Emil's trapped, and we need every hand we can get." Wade was already moving toward the barn. "I'll saddle up. Olivia, pack some food and medical supplies. Injuries?" "Don't know yet. His boy rode for help, half scared to death." Olivia didn't hesitate. While Wade prepared the horses, she filled a basket with bandages, whiskey for cleaning wounds, needle and thread for stitching. She added food bread, dried meat, whatever might sustain men doing hard labor. When Wade emerged leading 2 horses, she was ready. "You don't have to come," he said, though his expression suggested he knew better. "Yes, I do." She swung up into the saddle with practiced ease. "I've dealt with trail injuries. I might be needed." They rode hard, following Ben down treacherous paths Olivia had never traveled. The Turner place sat in a narrow valley, and as they approached, she could see the devastation. Half the hillside had given way, sending tons of rock cascading down. Men were already working, moving stones with desperate efficiency. "He's under there," someone called. "We can hear him, but can't reach him yet." Wade joined the line of men passing rocks, while Olivia set up a makeshift aid station. Soon enough, her skills were needed. Cuts to clean, bruised ribs to wrap, exhaustion to combat with water and food. She worked steadily, calmly, earning nods of respect from men who'd initially seemed surprised by her presence. As the sun began its descent, a shout went up. "We've got him! He's alive!" They pulled Emil Turner from his stone prison, battered but breathing. Olivia was there immediately, checking for breaks, cleaning wounds. The old man was tough as leather, complaining more about his ruined fence than his injuries. "You'll live," she pronounced, finishing the last bandage. "But you'll rest for a week, or I'll come back and tie you to your bed myself." "Yes, ma'am." Emil agreed meekly, earning chuckles from the gathered men. As they prepared to leave, Emil's wife pressed Olivia's hands. "Thank you, not just for the doctoring, but for coming, for caring." "It's what neighbors do," Olivia replied simply. The ride home was slower, exhaustion settling over them like dust. But there was satisfaction, too, the deep contentment that came from hard work done for good purpose. "You were something today," Wade said as they climbed the final hill to their cabin. "The way you took charge, kept everyone calm. You've got healing hands. Olivia." "I've got willing hands," she corrected. "That's all. Hands that want to help, to build, to matter." "They matter," he assured her. "You matter. To me, to this community, to this life we're creating." As they crested the ridge, their cabin came into view. Windows glowing in the last light. Home. But more than that, a center from which their life radiated outward, touching other lives, weaving into the fabric of the mountain community. They tended the horses in comfortable partnership, then made their way inside. The kitchen welcomed them with its familiar scents and shadows. Olivia lit the lamp while Wade built up the fire, the domestic dance they'd perfected over months of practice. "The stew pot's still in there," she said suddenly, smiling. "Want supper?" Wade looked at her. understanding the echo of that long-ago invitation. "Always," he said simply. She moved to the stove, began pulling ingredients from the shelves. He came up behind her, stilling her hands. "Olivia, what you said that first night about only cooking for someone who wouldn't leave when things got hard. I want you to know I'm never leaving. Not when rocks fall or winters rage or life gets complicated. This is it for me. You're it for me." She turned in his arms, saw the truth of it in his eyes. "I know," she whispered. "I've known since you handed me your mother's knives, since you read me poetry while snow fell, since you danced with me without asking." "Good," he said, and kissed her not gentle this time, but with all the passion and promise of a man who'd found his match and knew it. When they finally parted, Olivia was breathless but laughing. "The stew," she protested weakly. "Can wait," Wade decided, and kissed her again. Much later, they sat by the fire with bowls of hastily prepared soup. Tired but content, Wade had his poetry book open but wasn't reading, just watching the flames dance. Olivia worked on piecing a quilt, her needle moving in steady rhythm. "Read to me," she asked, as she had so many times before. He chose Byron tonight, words about mountains and freedom and the wild beauty of untamed places. His voice wrapped around her like warmth itself, turning simple words into music. This was what she'd traveled so far to find, not just love, though that was part of it. Not just home, though that mattered too. But this feeling of rightness, of being exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was meant to do. When the poem ended, she set aside her sewing and moved to sit beside him on the floor, her head on his shoulder. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. But inside all was warm and safe and sure. "No regrets?" Wade asked one more time, their private ritual. "Not one," Olivia answered truthfully. "Every choice, every mile, every hard moment brought me here. How could I regret the path that led me home?" He pressed a kiss to her hair, and they sat quietly, watching the fire burn low. In the morning there would be chores and challenges, gardens to tend and neighbors to help. But tonight there was just the two of them, the crackle of flames, and the deep satisfaction of a life well chosen. She closed the door to his cabin that first snowy night, not knowing what she'd find within. What she'd discovered was everything: love, purpose, partnership, and the truth that sometimes the best journeys were the ones that brought you home, not to a place you'd left, but to a place you'd never known you were looking for until you arrived. The wind sang its mountain song, and Olivia smiled, safe in the circle of Wade's arms. Let it blow. Let winter come again with its challenges. She'd weathered worse storms than weather could bring. And now, finally, she had what she'd never dared dream of: a love worth building on, a life worth living fully, and a future as wide and promising as the Montana sky. In choosing Wade, in choosing this life, she'd chosen herself, and that, more than anything, was why she could close her eyes each night without regret, knowing that tomorrow would bring its own gifts, its own challenges, its own quiet victories. She was Olivia Langston, now wife, neighbor, woman of the frontier. But more than that, she was simply herself, finally and fully, in a place where that was exactly enough. The girl who'd fled Missouri in shame had become a woman who stood tall in Montana sunshine, unashamed and unafraid. And if that wasn't a happy ending, she didn't know what was. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to hear where you're listening from. Please share in the comments below so we can connect and discuss what you thought of Olivia and Wade's journey. If you enjoyed this tale from the American frontier, please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 like this video, and hit the hype button to help more people discover these stories of love, courage, and finding home in the untamed West. Your support means everything and helps keep these stories alive.